Okay, so we're going to go over French cinema, 1930s and beyond. Obviously, based on our past, we have identified 1929 as Great Depression. Much of this means that the U.S. can no longer fund Europe, specifically Germany, after the war, and we're having all these polarized, remember these discourses, oppositions going on, which allows eventually for World War II to take place, and then we're going to talk a little bit about post-war. I'm not so sure if we get into it here in terms of France. Let me check at the very, yeah. We talk about occupied France. We don't really get into too much, but obviously I will be gesturing out towards it throughout the video about what happens in post-war, especially since we are going to be comparing this most intimately to Italian neorealism, which is the video that will come after. So I'm going to make you pause the video and watch some of the clips on your own, which this is going to be important to the exams, because this is how in the past I've always been testing you on these kinds of things. How did we represent it? How did we show it as an example? So of course you're going to have to go to YouTube. All of these are written in the notes, the ones that are, oh, I don't think they're bolded in your notes, but I will let you know which ones we need to watch together. Some of those are just examples in case you want to check out more from the movement, if you ever go to a class specific to it, want to study it, etc. So let's get started. We're talking about René Clair. Oh, and before everything gets going, I am going to go through these very quickly. We're going to try to make the lecture portion not as extensive as we would do in class, because I don't have the means to a board and whatnot. This means that the majority of our kind of like chalkboard session is going to be met in that forum. If you have any questions that remain open, which I expect there to be, you do have an attendance assignment to put that in there. You also can go to the other board if you don't want to wait and you need a question answered and you need other people to be looking at it as well. You can use the discussion board that isn't the assignment one. It's going to be called, I think, logistics and whatnot, to go post about classroom activities as well there. So don't be afraid to use that. So René Clair, the first clip I am going to have you open to is À nous la liberté, and it's the first one at the very top of your notes. You can go ahead and click all the way to 14 minutes and watch it to 19 minutes, and I would expect you to pause my video at this point. Check it out in the middle there, and we can talk about what's going to be most important and what you're going to see on the exam. In the meantime, René Clair is famous for his films that he made during the 1930s, and almost only those in the 30s. And the reason for that is because, unlike the Swedish and Italian filmmakers who go to Hollywood and their styles tend to stick and they enjoy it there, many of the French filmmakers can't make it there. Some of them get very depressed by the constraints of the industry, because Francis specifically, these are some of these things that you should know by now, the things that we're going over that we would have bullet points for, right? Francis specifically at this time moving into niche international distribution, which means that they are moving towards art films, remember? And they're also moving towards newsreel. So when you have these very independent type production things, they don't have big production methods, right? They're working with little sets, little budgets. A lot of times they will cast on location. All of these kinds of aesthetics that come about are things that do not work very well, that specifically won't make it, right? All of the artistic conceptual work, this poetic kind of cinema, it's not going to be profitable, which means that they won't make it. Specifically for René Clair, he goes out to Hollywood. He comes back, he is so depressed, they say he never makes another good film again. Of course, in this class, we always define what good means, because good is an ideological and a subjective determination. So good, of course, in this instance means he cannot get back into that level of artistic creativity anymore after those, the Hollywood constraints that say you make it in this way or else it's not going to be profitable by audiences, right? So Clair is known specifically for his creative uses of sound. He's not really interested, even though a narrative does unfold usually in much of his work, it's not like he's actively attempting to tell a straight narrative story. He takes a concept, and the concept in this instance for the clip that I've asked you to watch is that there is no functional difference between a factory, between working in prison, and working in a school, right? He's directly making those comparisons with the toys, the kinds of factory worker outfits, the prison makers who are making the toys, right? And then also the same way in which all of the people inside of those industry are suited up in the same kind of they have this external outfit that expresses, like the prisoners, right, who have the jumpsuit that expresses a station, and it's all compartmentalized in the same way that production of the toys is compartmentalized. And then of course at the very beginning of this clip we have that pop culture element added to it, in which the clip begins with him putting this poppy tune on the radio as we move into the workforce, right? So we'll move on. We'll go ahead and talk about the movement as a whole, because that was just the first paragraph. We're moving on to this French cinema in the 1930s general area. And I would encourage you to follow alongside the notes. This is what I'm going to be using while I go, so that I can make sure that we're all on the same page and we're following along over the course of the video, and that'll be very easy for you. I'm going to try as hard as possible not to jump around like I will in class, because I don't think that's going to work very well here. So this period that we're talking about is around the time the Depression hits France, right? Remember that globalization is in not full swing, but it is beginning to the point in which everything is now international. And so when one economy is affected, other economies are too. Remember, we had a high point of the Great Depression in the US, which was not 1929, but it was, I think, 1932 we put for the purposes of this class. And if you see their decline started around 1931. So it doesn't even hit until then. But this is kind of the way that it paces itself out. Now, especially we're talking about the increasingly interconnected global economy with what's happening now. You notice how quickly economies now respond to each other. They don't take years to respond anymore. And I think that's a great example of how we can see everything speeding up over the course of globalization in its development. So Nazis show up in the 1940s. This is when they get occupied. By the time they get to 1930, French production is already unstable. It's not necessarily like the Nazis show up and they make French production unstable. Their market is becoming more fragmented, which makes sense, right? If you have this awesome climate. So their market is becoming fragmented. Let's back up. Specifically because they are no longer one of the majors, right? Which means that you no longer have the budget. You no longer have this solidified productive workforce. And so those start breaking up into these smaller chunks, right? And I'm trying to give you whatever I can in terms of a visual representation just by using hand gestures. So it becomes fragmented. This makes literally the perfect climate for artistic and independent production, which means terrible production budgets, weak studio system, perfect climate for filmmakers to not have any sort of boss that says that you have to make films this way, right? Because all of the budget is theirs, and so they can do what they want with it. So their cinema is very influential. It's held in high regard, even if they're not big money makers, and that's half the reason why entering into this class, you have some idea of what French filmmaking even means. Most of the time that what we get from the New Wave, French New Wave in like the 60s after is it's so completely artistic because it's deriving from this culture that at its very base was not this classical cinema industrialized Fordist logic, right? None of their parts were saying we have to script filmed this way, people write with this narrative structure, and then we move it and people costume with these kinds of things in mind. Right? It wasn't broken up like that. And so if you begin on a very different structure, they now move into the 60s with more affordances available to them, right? And we've talked about affordances and limitations before. We're going to continue to talk about those going forward in pretty much everything. Once we get to the new waves after this, and once we get into our contemporary cinema, we're always going to be asking, what are the constraints? What are the affordances at this time period? And so that's something to keep in mind. French cinema is more significant artistically than anything else. Disproportionate amount of films that are highly regarded creatively, which is incredibly important when you have no production budgets, right? The idea that internationally you're highly regarded as like these prestige films without any of that. 1922, fascists form a new government and take over Italy. 1932, Nazis take power in Germany. By the mid-30s, there's a war in Spain, resulting in Franco taking over, and France is now completely surrounded by fascism. This is the context in which we're working with. The same way that we've always run out the historical context before we talk about aesthetics before. A lot of political pressure. A lot of these corrupt French officials end up moving into Morocco, which is what almost the entirety of the movie Casablanca, remember, is that WB film. And we were talking about this, what is WB known for? And I would sit here and pause if we were in a class, and you guys, eventually there would be one of you, like after a weird silence, who would say, working class narratives or progressive narratives, which obviously this is not the working class that we're talking about in terms of the way that the French right now and their affordances are doing working class films. It's not working class narratives in the way that we're about to talk Italian neorealism, where they're actually affording. It's the way in which mainstream can aestheticize working class aestheticize working class and progressive narratives, because they have way too many constraints to actually be for the working class is the important thing here, right? But it's the aesthetic of progression as much as they possibly can be. They include it in the narrative. None of the actual formal elements are for the working class. So that's the distinction to be made. So France is still allowed, however, film production never stops in France. The Nazis actually explicitly keep it going because the biggest thing here is think about what Hitler is thinking. There is fascism all over Europe. Does Hitler think that he's going to lose? This is the part where one of you would say, no, he doesn't. He has no clue that he is going to lose the war. So he plans to keep French on board as this kind of artistic productive capital, and he loves movies. Hitler loves movies. He loves almost every fascist ends up loving some sort of propaganda outlet. So this is what I think is kind of the confusing part of using Pan's Labyrinth and having this very strict, easy to read, which remember, historically, why do directors use characters that are easy to read? Typage, Soviet montage. Remember, Del Toro is doing the same exact thing by using the storybook format. He's saying that even though he comes from this incredible Mexican art cinema background, and specifically this Mexican cinema art is like very working class based, right? And he moves into Hollywood, and now he knows that he has to make these, he has to maximize profits, right? So he has to make spectacle. He has to make all of these types of Hollywood things that are going to do, he has to pretend that his narratives are closed, that they're not open-ended. And so he's coming up with all these formal ways in which he says, how can I best reach the masses? Well, unfortunately, that's through popular culture, right? Well, how can I retain my ethics within the constraints that popular culture allows me to work within? And that's what Del Toro has developed his entire aesthetics out of. That's why we use it to start this class, right? To say that constraints don't mean that it's not possible. Constraints mean that you have to get creative. You have to ask the questions. And a lot of, again, what's going on in the political sphere right now is saying, well, if these are the new constraints, well, then the problem is we're not coming up with solutions because no one's ever asking the questions, right? Hopefully that makes sense to you right now, but we don't have time to go into that. So let me figure out where I left off in the notes. Film production declines dramatically in World War II. I'm sorry, that's a mistake in the note. Sound is going to give them a boost because French audiences are excited to hear French spoken in films, the beautiful language. French people are also known for loving their culture. It's why they enact a quota system, right? Because they are trying to preserve French culture. They're still trying to do it to this day, which globalization makes almost impossible. 158 films in this period, in contrast to Hollywood, Germany, Japan putting out 600 films per year. And that should tell you something about both the budget and the positioning within the larger societal as this art film kind of hub. Largest French company is making in a decade what Paramount comes out within a year, to give you some sort of relative proportion. Both Belmont and Pathé try to force each other out of business. Remember, Pathé was the one who was horizontally integrated when we talked about them originally, which, as a refresher, means that they also own the production means for film stock. Both are wrought with corruption. It becomes this kind of endemic in France, the same way that we talked about there was genuinely corruption within the movie, like Hollywood, back in these days, because we didn't have the same kinds of monopoly regulations as we did. They literally were like gangsters who were like taking out kneecaps of people who were encroaching on markets. And I'm using this as a visual tool, right, the taking out kneecaps things, to exemplify to you a whole other slew of things that were going on in this kind of corrupt environment. So then finally they're sent to prison for embezzlement, and when that happens, the government finally breaks them up into smaller companies. And then by 1941, most French movie theaters are playing French movies again. I have Apropos de Nice written there next to Jean Vigo because it's an important film. It's not one that you need to pause and watch a clip from. It's just something that I think you would like if you're interested in this kind of poetic floating style. Vigo's super young. He actually dies very young, dies at 29. Very fantasy, surrealist oriented, and I am going to have you watch a clip by him once I give you this context. He only made 1 feature film and 3 short films. Very different style than René Clair, and I will actually have you jump down the notes very quickly luckily it is italicized. It's after the L'Atalante and Le Jour se lève, where it says it's not a solidified movement like Soviet montage, but remember one of our test question was, would you say that Soviet montage was this completely solidified movement? And our answer was false. What I mean by that inside of these notes is it's not that Soviet montage all presented the same. We saw that, right? We saw the very difference between the poetic hooliganism versus the very strict version in which Eisenstein did his montage, right? What I'm trying to say is that it doesn't have any identifiable formal qualities, and I probably should have written that in the notes, but I did want to, especially since we worded the test question the opposite way. But this is the point. Whereas in Soviet montage, we can say, these two directors look very differently and aesthetically are presenting ideas very differently, and they don't like each other. However, we could say they both use this, right? We could list these formal qualities in which they both belong to the movement, regardless of how they came out aesthetically. You can't say the same thing here. Everything is just about this surrealist, poetic aesthetic. You can't describe it via any formal qualities. It changes depending from director to director. So if I were to ask you about a question about the distinction between that might happen. But let me move on. So this is context for Vigo. Again, this is not René Clair anymore. Born to a family of anarchists, lived on the run under the pseudonyms because his father was wanted, fell in love with making movies at an early age, started making movies in 1929, but released the first in 1930. Speaking of which, since we went into Soviet montage, this is why I include this tidbit. He made movies with Boris Kaufman, who is the brother of Dziga Vertov. And remember, Dziga Vertov was the one who Eisenstein hated because he called it pointless camera hooliganism. Because Dziga Vertov was the guy with the dancing camera that we showed, who in the middle of this like documentary where he is comparing all these genuine documentary shots to each other, the windows opening and closing, to the shutter on a camera, to the shutter of eyes waking up in the morning. It's this very poetic aesthetic that vibes incredibly well with poetic realism and with what's going on now in the 30s. And so when you think about that, if I were to ask you the same question, well, would Eisenstein vibe very well with these kinds of directors? The answer would probably be no. And the point of that is being, yes, Dziga Vertov and Eisenstein both belonged to Soviet montage, and they both had very similar formal qualities. However, they were very different filmmakers, right? Just because the aesthetics are the same doesn't mean the ideology is the same. And just because the ideology or the formal structure might be the same, it doesn't mean the aesthetics present the same. And the greatest example of that is, of course, post-war noir in the US, right? Because you think of what are the two kinds of things that are going on in post-war US. And we've already talked about this classical, this beauty style in which everything is bright, everything is 3-point lighting, everything is this mass production era in which the economy was spurred after the war, and they're busting out all these, I use the cans of soup example, right? Everything looks the same. And it's what we parody now in movies where they put and a lot of times they use that song, the little boxes in the housetops, right? And then they show a shot of all the houses and how they look the same, and they've all got the white picket fences and all the women look the same. These are the kinds of movies and shows that are being mocked because they were genuine in this time. And we have this happy domestic heterosexual couple and this housewife, right? And we have this guy, good morning kids, all of this kind of things. And then what's the other thing going on this time? Noir. And it's the complete opposite aesthetically, right? How do we get something so aesthetically different from something that is so ideologically the same, right? And so aesthetically, we have this anti-hero. This is where all of our downtrodden male anti-heroes come out of. And now in the postmodern era, we have like Jessica Jones, where it's like, oh, a woman can be an alcoholic too. And also, and so now we're starting to say, oh, we can move queer people and black people into these roles, but as long as we keep the structure in which the anti-hero is one of these like little boxes that people can play, now we can let other people play them. Hopefully this is making sense to you. But in this era, it was almost always this like white male. Why? Because what was at stake during this ideological period. This is why we have two different types of females that gravitate within these narratives in the noir. And this is where the term la femme fatale comes from, because we have the Spider Woman, and she is always the sexually deviant one, right? And she's always being violently punished in noirs. And then we have this bright, this pure woman, this maiden, right, character, who is usually the one who's supposed to get together with the anti-hero, who's so corrupt and he has no choice but because of the corruption around him to go along with these plots, because he has to get something that he needs, right? And same with everyone else. Everyone's at the whims of the corruption that exists kind of in the air, like immaterially, where because they need money for their next apartment or they're forced to do a job, right? And the problem is that for them in this era, whereas one is saying the domestic couple could get together and they could be happy if we would just go back to these values of domesticity, right? If the woman would just stay in the kitchen, right, instead of going into the workforce, which they did after the war, because we needed mass production of war materials and other materials, of all these other things. If women would stop selling Tupperware, then we could be this again, right? We could be this classical era couple. And then the other side of it is the same ideology. It's the anxiety. This is what happens if we don't. So almost never does the couple get together at the end of this, because there's goop, at the end of this, right? Because something tragic has to get in the way of that, because they have to show what happens when no longer can the maiden get the happy ending because of all the sexual immorality and the corruption that's going on around her, right? They're the same exact ideology. They're using the same exact structural and formal elements to construct them. Nothing has changed between the editing styles and the cinematography in either of these. But yet one is this dismal aesthetic content. The other is this happy, everything's perfect aesthetic content. This is what we mean. So, moving on. Filmmaking is very, obviously he came out of anarchists, is very critical of the money class and the distinct, and this is the reason we go off on this tangent. Neither of these are genuinely critical of, right? Neither of these are, they're formed in this very propaganda-like style again. Remember, we're talking about, especially when we are about to, in the next lecture after this, talk about post-war, completely post-war. People completely abandon in Europe this very classical propaganda associated style. We don't. So when we get there in terms of Europe, they are so scared of the devastation that we definitely get, it's not to say we're not influenced by all the artistic movements. We definitely get artistic directors who finally start, this is where we start getting what we call auteur theory, right? Where they even can start naming Hitchcock as a auteur, because they're starting to say, oh, individuals have specific styles. It's not just movements or genres. And this is where we start getting where you can talk about Quentin Tarantino, and when I make the thing where I'm like, who's the guy with foot fetish and he likes swords and whatnot, you guys are like, Quentin Tarantino, right? Because we start getting auteur because of this whole prospect in which artistic styles allow to influence the US post-war, even though we're not moving from that in the mainstream. Where that can at least be profitable, is what I'm saying. So he criticizes the money class and the distinct lifestyles that they're allowed to experience. Remember, this is still pre-war. And Nice, which is the place where people with money go to enjoy the sun in France. This is kind of the same how we were talking about the critical of this leisure class in the US. So this is one that I do want you to watch. It's called Zero de Conduite. If the kids are united, if you just copy and paste all of that into YouTube, it should be the first one. I don't have it pulled up anymore, but I do think I remember. I think it's 2 minutes in. Hold on, let me actually just pull this up. Sorry, I did not mean to make you wait. I had everything pulled up, but I think I closed out of it. I was like, oh, remember that. It's so short. So yeah, this way I can tell it is the first one that pops up in videos if you type that directly into Google. If you move to 2 minutes, this is where you will see the stark contrast between, I would even watch the whole thing if you have time for it, but if you move to 2 minutes, if you don't have time, you'll see that the kids, we have this very, like, this soundscape where the kids are all trumpeting, screaming. They have, it's clearly this comparison to the workers rising up, right, the working class, when really it's kids inside of the school. They realize that they can't be contained by their one headmaster or whatnot, so we can do whatever we want. So they start playing, they realize there's more of them, and then as soon as you get to, I think it's 2:20, we've got trumpets playing, we have feathers in the air, you can see the chaos. You might have paused me by now, but at least you're going to continue. And then this stark moment of silence. And this just beautiful, almost surreal backflip, right? And it's, again, with talking about especially this hitting on this idea of clothing as demonstrating this certain class, or now in the US demonstrating subcultural values, this idea of this not caring about clothing, it flows anywhere, right? And they have this parade that almost looks like the parade inside of this like utopian parade inside of that we saw became very chaotic and actually not utopian. Why can't I think of the other movie that we used as our core? Paprika, right? It's this utopian parade of what could be if we didn't have this structure already in place. And that's what they're celebrating. And they're especially celebrating it through children who don't have as solidified terms of what the social world means yet. They don't have a solidified views of laws and why. Does that make sense? I can't hear you, but hopefully that makes sense. If it doesn't, include it in a comment. This might be a place to go to the comment. But you can see that very poetic style of film, and especially that it's almost like sublime, that moment that like everything stops and then it just slows down, and it's absolutely beautiful. So let's move on. This is what we're terming poetic realism, juggernaut of movements for France in the 1930s. We've talked about the not a solidified movement. Does center on people at the margins of society, like Soviet montage, like Italian neorealism. This sounds like, if I've got three things here, poetic realism, this sounds like a great multiple choice question on an exam, right? Where we would say, which one of these does not focus on the working class? And you would choose one of those. Centers people on the margins of society. Working class people, criminals, prostitutes, often set where they have one more chance at something. Usually love oftentimes ends in death, tragic, like noir German expressionism. Noir often is cited as this like predecessor to German expressionism, and yet this is equally as much, if not more so, and a huge influence on noir. Not uncommon to suffer at the hands of censors, dramatically hampered by the French government, because they were scared by the thought of presenting France pessimism. At the time, France was scared to death of the Nazis. They didn't want to reflect that sentiment outwardly. They want to instead represent France as a proud, strong nation, because they do not want to get the idea that they're losing steam. This was their means for communication. This is why we track right, morale and whatnot, and the way that people are feeling, because they express it through aesthetics. And so they're not trying to reflect any sort of vulnerability outward when the enemy is also watching these films. The difference between this is that it's very clear a lot of the allegory that was going on, and you don't need to pause right now, I'll tell you when to pause. You do need to watch that next bolded movie, The Children of Paradise Baptiste pickpocket scene, because you will see the very clear allegory between this guy, and again, we're using, this is a great term for you to remember, right? This kind of, oh gosh, and now it's slipping my mind, this character structure. I just said it. I said it at the beginning of the video. So if you go back there, you can find it. This character structure where they use the guys who have the collars, right, the frilly lace, and they're all done up. They've got like monocles and whatnot, so that they can easily convey to working class people who is who. And then instead, on the other hand, we have this woman, and she's actually pretty done up too, but you can tell that he's accusing her of pickpocketing her. I think it's his stopwatch, if I remember correctly. And so who are they reliant on to tell the truth? Well, they look up at the mime, right? And the mime can't say anything. And this is the allegory, of course. The allegory is, this is where France is positioned, right? In which they can't say anything explicitly, so they have to use allegory and they have to use jokes. And this is a tradition that dates back to English monarchs, right? And this is where the phrase "speak the truth to power" comes from, because the only person back in the day who could ever speak the truth to power, if something needed to be said to the king, you say it to the jester. You get the jester to make a joke out of it, because that's the only guy, and still I'm not saying that none of them were beheaded, I'm saying that's the only guy who has a chance at not getting beheaded for speaking the truth to power, because then you can say it's just a joke. Or in this instance, the same way with Pan's Labyrinth, we say it's just a fairy story. It's just a narrative. And this is why narratives are never just narratives, right? Myth is never just that. And so you can see them representing themselves and you can pause now and then go ahead and watch it if you want to continue the lecture at this point. And you can see the mime, and he's like very poetically laying this out. He's also making jokes, making the crowd laugh. But then we get the truth through someone who can't speak. So I include this tidbit, as I always do, like some things that don't really matter, just because I think they're super funny. Arletty, who was this really well-known actress in France, she was confronted about her relationship with a Nazi, even though she was belonging to these very art cinema type scenes, who are the only remaining point of resistance, right? Because of Hitler is allowing them to continue. He knows. It's not like they're not dumb. It's not like they're not getting these allegories inside of the films. It's that they don't care. They don't think that they're going to lose. So they let them happen, right? As long as they're not explicit. So when confronted about her relationship with a Nazi, she replies, "Did you see him? Ultimately, my heart belongs to France, but my ass belongs to me," which is hilarious. And it also demonstrates a bunch of the kind of like feminist movements that were going on at the time, right? This advancement towards sexuality that would then be demonized post-war, of course. So thematically, we've already talked about noir much closely follows poetic realism, tend to make the jump to the aesthetics of German expressionism. We're going to move past this real quick. You can read this on your own. These are not, the Vichy industry you're not going to be tested on. So let's move into this last paragraph. And what I do challenge you to do with this last paragraph, since we're already pushing, I think, 30 minutes on this lecture, is to do the same thing that I told you to do, that I'm challenging you to do for these last 4 classes, especially since they're going to be online. And part of what I want you to do is to be able to take these paragraphs, which are already versions of this high theory that doesn't make sense unless you know all the other things that are happening, right? This convoluted theory, and then I break it down into this paragraph for you and say, this is essentially what happened. No, none of these things that I'm showing you of what happened are ever going to be the complexities of the situation. They're never going to be the intricacies of the details. But our job is to get you to understand the concepts so that we can move into the intricacies and the details. Well, why do these concepts prove to be true? Why are these tendencies things that tend to happen? And hopefully all of your other courses will help you develop it. So I'm going to read this to you, and hopefully for you, you can pick out the bullet points. What are the most important parts of this? Because this is not how I would ever structure a paragraph to turn in anywhere. This is a stream of consciousness. This is what happened. And you should be able to read this as some sort of narrative and say, well, that seems important. These seem like I said, here are the 3 things. That sounds like which one of these is not a thing on this test. So that you can make comparisons and say, well, how is this movement like this movement? How is this movement unlike this movement? Well, maybe it's like this movement in other ways. So then if it's like this movement, what are the similarities between what we're going on in this history and their history that made certain aesthetics bubble up and other ones not, right? And if this is the same as this movement, right? And so you can start making comparisons between different historical circumstances and what tends to happen in aesthetics once you get to that point that you can juggle these much easier, right? And the same thing, even if this is not your field, which I know it's not, especially after the discussion posts, especially if this is not your field, it's the same thing for everything. You have to read patterns and aesthetics from every single kind of, whatever is your field of study. What kinds of rhetoric are people using when they're writing about this topic? What kinds of verbs do they use? What kinds of sentence structure do they use to make their point? Everything is a rhetoric. Everything is also montage. Why are they positioning this, right, this point next to this point, next to this point, to make you draw this overall conclusion? Well, what about this thing that they left out? What conclusion would you have drawn if you does this make, okay, I can't say that anymore, but if you had this conclusion and you had inserted it into the montage, now you might draw a different conclusion. Everything is aesthetics. It's why it's so important. So let's read through this, and then we'll move on to Italian neorealism, which is excellent, and we're going to talk about that extensively. So initially in occupied France, film production is banned altogether until attendance fell. Because they were showing other films, they allowed film production to resume in France. The question is, why did they allow it? If they didn't need the film industry to be strong, the Germans thought they were going to win the war. They have a unified Europe under German control. France was going to be one of the cultural leaders in the new era. They want to strategically employ France as their empire, as their cultural center, which in general, where is our cultural center? It tends to be New York and LA right now, right? Every empire, quote unquote, has a cultural production center as well. Healthy industry would help them dominate other markets. German censorship was surprisingly lenient, banned Jewish people from working in the film industry and Jewish actors, regardless of their other leniencies. Hopefully that makes sense to you. About 75% of Jewish French were in concentration camps, did not survive the war. That's a butt ton of people. But Jewish filmmakers often managed to flee to the U.S. because of their prestige. The same with, if you look at, honestly, even educational. If you look at theorists, for instance, I come from Frankfurt School background. Almost all of those theorists within the Frankfurt School were Jewish, and they all fled at around the same time. Pretty much anyone who's in any sort of arts, culture, movement, they're fleeing as much as possible, usually getting to the U.S. and usually getting very downtrodden once they do get there. So, but some survived, some people, I know one of my big theorists committed suicide because he could not get through the border either with or without his wife, I forget which. So Jewish filmmakers often managed to flee to the U.S. because they were cultural producers, much less sneaking around, more letting resistance slips because they knew the French will like it. Germans assumed they'd win anyway, they turned the other cheek. And this is what we talked about, how they weren't, but the important part here, of course, even though I'm telling you anyways, is resistant films weren't really sticking it to them. If I were to ask you a question about that, well, the fact of the matter is the Germans allowed it, right? Why did all of this happen? And then I might use other things to pretend like it wasn't allowed, right? And you would pick, no, they knew about this. Much like the way Hollywood allows quote-unquote resistance to this day, right? Because it's literally profitable. It's literally aestheticized. It's why so many, especially when we talk about anti-hero, it's why so many dudes associate themselves with the red pill, or, do you take the red pill or the blue pill? And you're like, I'm the one who truly knows. When we've talked about the fact of the matter about ideology is no one has the full view. No one has that Hitchcock where you think you have the full view, you think that you've put together just the correct pieces. There is so much more that you don't know that is not coming into your view, right? And so we have these people who associate with resistance narratives, like the Matrix, who on the surface, it's a resistance narrative. Why do we allow it through? Because we need people to aesthetically associate with resistance without actually, and if they think that they're aesthetically associating with it, then they won't look to formally do it, if that makes sense. So that's the end of my poetic realism resistance during the World War II era. I hope that you enjoyed that. I'm gonna hopefully, I mean, it's 40 minutes. I'm gonna try to keep them short, but it's only 5 minutes shorter than our usual lectures. Sometimes, 20 minutes, depending on how long. I will see you during the neorealism video.